Welcome to this explainer. Okay, so if you've been following the conflict in the Donbas, you've probably noticed a really glaring paradox. Reported fighting is literally at an all-time high, right? Yet, the map? It's barely moving. Today, we're cutting through all the noise. We're going to look strictly at the hard numbers and the calculated strategies that are driving what is undoubtedly one of the most intense military engagements of the 21st century. Let's get right into it. To unpack this complex strategy, we're going to follow a really clear 5-part roadmap. We'll start with the battlefield paradox, then examine the fortress belt, check out the drone advantage, break down the math of attrition, and wrap up by analyzing the strategic outlook. Part 1. The battlefield paradox. High assaults versus negative returns. So military analysts are reporting a massive contradiction on the ground right now. Get this, in just a single week, there was a staggering surge of 1,384 combat clashes. That's an average of nearly 198 attacks every single day, heavily concentrated in places like Pokrovsk and Huliaipol. But here's the kicker. Despite that overwhelming sheer volume of force, the result for the entire month of April was a net territorial loss of 116.01 square kilometers. You heard that right. An unprecedented tempo of assaults is somehow yielding negative progress. And you can see exactly how this high-intensity strategy is yielding progressively less ground month over month. In January, advances covered roughly 318.5 square kilometers. By February, that number more than halved, dropping down to about 122.7. And by March, a nearly stagnant 23 square kilometers. It's like running full speed into a brick wall. So we really have to ask, what is physically stopping this massive amount of force? Well, that brings us to part 2, the fortress belt, Ukraine's multi-layered defense. To really understand this stagnation, we've got to look at the physical obstacles in the way. We're talking about a defensive network systematically built up over the last 12 years. Forces literally have to bypass natural river barriers, dense minefields, concrete tank obstacles, reinforced bunkers, and these modern drone kill zones just to reach the Donbas administrative borders. It's a massive, multi-layered approach, and it perfectly explains why flanking maneuvers are failing and traditional brute force is just stalling out. Because those flanking maneuvers are effectively blocked, forces now have to break through essentially head-on. As Ukrainian military analyst Konstantin Mashovets points out, this direct approach is, quote, slow, exhausting, and above all, extremely bloody and costly. It's no longer about sweeping advances. It has become a grinding, brutal battle against heavily fortified positions. Moving on to part 3, the drone advantage, a technological shift. Now, physical barriers, they're really only half the story here. There is a critical shift in aerial dominance that's completely changing the math. According to Ukrainian Brigadier General Pavlo Polisa, Ukraine is currently deploying 30% more strike drones than Russia across multiple frontline sectors. 30%. That is a massive pivot. By rapidly scaling up both the quantity and the quality of their unmanned systems, Ukraine has managed to seize a localized but highly effective technological edge. And you know, this advantage isn't just happening at the absolute zero line. Middle-range drones are now striking targets up to 100 kilometers behind enemy lines. Think about that. By targeting major transport routes in places like Horlivka and Zurez, these drones are systematically shattering logistical supply chains, long before the troops or the resources even make it to the active front. This kind of deep technological reach allows for the creation of what military strategists are calling kill zones. Basically, these are designated geographic areas totally overwhelmed by drone surveillance and constant strikes. The strategy here is pretty clear. Expand these zones to heavily attrit and degrade ground forces during their initial approach. They're essentially inflicting maximum casualties before direct, face-to-face frontline engagement even starts. Which brings us to the hardest data of this explainer. Part 4, the math of attrition. Calculating the human cost. When you combine the physical fortress belt with those drone-infested kill zones we just talked about, the human cost becomes highly quantifiable. 156,735. That is the staggering number of confirmed Russian soldiers lost in just a 5-month window, right between December 2025 and April 2026, as tracked by Ukraine's Army of Drones system. And keep in mind, these are only the individually logged losses. The actual total number, it could very well be higher. And here's where we see a compounding logistical problem that military analysts are closely watching. Recruitment is mathematically failing to keep pace with these extreme frontline casualty rates. Over that exact same 5-month period, forces fell over 8,000 soldiers short of simply replacing the troops that were confirmed lost. When an offensive burns through its manpower faster than it can be regenerated, well, the pace of assaults mathematically cannot be sustained in the long term without making unit sizes smaller and significantly more vulnerable. But if there's one single metric I really want you to take away from this explainer today, it's this one right here, 316. According to the reported data, 316 soldiers are currently being lost for every single square kilometer of land captured in Donetsk. To put that into perspective, that is exactly double the rate of casualties for the exact same amount of territorial gain compared to the same period last year. It is literally costing twice as much human capital to take the exact same amount of ground. So let's run that math through to its logical conclusion. There are roughly 6,000 square kilometers of remaining territory in Donetsk that would need to be captured to claim the Donbas. At the current casualty rate of 316 soldiers per square kilometer, taking the rest of that territory projects out to a truly staggering 1.896 million total casualties. It's an incredibly bleak mathematical projection, and it really highlights just how intensely costly this attritional warfare has become. Let's zoom out a bit for our final section, Part 5, the strategic outlook, deadlines and endgames. As you might expect, when the math on the ground changes, the deadlines in the political offices inevitably have to shift. The original Kremlin deadline for total capture of the Donbas was the end of May 2026. But as the push stalled out against that Fortress Belt, it was revised to September 2026. However, military analysts looking at the actual rate of advance right now, they estimate it would realistically take at least a year and a half. That pushes the timeline to late 2027 at the absolute earliest. The geopolitical goals are just entirely misaligned with the mathematical realities. Based strictly on the analysts' assessments of this data, there are really only two potential strategic outcomes to this kind of attritional warfare. First, forces just continue the push, effectively exhausting their own military capacity to claim the territory, which of course risks severe long-term vulnerability elsewhere. Or, second, the sheer weight of attrition eventually shatters the capacity for further assaults altogether, halting advances completely and potentially opening the door for a pushback. The data suggests these are really the two logical endgames. Which leaves us with this final, really provocative question to consider. Can any military actually sustain an advance when the mathematical cost of every single square kilometer continues to double? The numbers we've looked at today strongly suggest that brute force is running headfirst into the hard limits of 21st century attrition. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this deep dive into the raw battlefield data gives you a clearer, more structured understanding of the reality and the long-term sustainability of the Donbas conflict. Keep asking questions, keep looking closely at the data, and I'll catch you